We've all heard politicians make big promises. Whether it's better healthcare, lower taxes, or sweeping reforms, it's easy to get caught up in the excitement. But here's the hard truth: 39% of political promises never get delivered. Even when they do, it takes an average of 3 to 5 years, far longer than anyone expects. Why does it take so long? Is it bureaucracy, global pressure, or something else entirely? And what about the $3.7 billion that lobbyists spent in 2022? Could that be part of the problem? In this video, we're diving deep into the hidden reasons political promises drag on for years, if they ever happen at all. We'll look at the delays, tactics, and even the technologies that might finally speed things up. Stay tuned, because what you're about to learn will change the way you see politics forever. Chapter 1: The slow burn of modern politics. Why promises stall. When politicians make promises, they often sound immediate, almost as if change is around the corner. But in reality, the process is slow and full of delays. Why is that? The political system, particularly in democratic nations, is built around checks and balances. While this protects us from impulsive decisions, it also slows down progress. Take the United States Congress as an example. According to the Congressional Research Service, the average bill takes 263 days to move through the legislative process. Now, consider the amount of coordination needed to get that bill passed: committee reviews, debates, amendments, and votes. Even when a law is passed, implementing it can take years. But it's not just about bureaucracy. Politicians often face partisan gridlock, where opposing parties block each other's moves. In fact, between 2011 and 2016, Congress only passed 2.8% of introduced bills, the lowest in modern history. Both sides were more focused on undermining the other than on delivering on their promises. Another layer is the over-reliance on symbolic gestures. Politicians often announce big, shiny policies but provide little substance. These gestures make great headlines, but rarely get followed up with serious legislation. For example, President Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty in 1964 was a bold promise. Yet, 50 years later, the poverty rate in the US remains relatively unchanged. This leads to one conclusion: promises made under the glare of the spotlight often fade in the shadows of political reality. Chapter 2: Campaigning versus Governing. The real cost of empty promises. The stark difference between campaigning and governing is one of the main reasons why promises aren't kept. On the campaign trail, politicians are in full sales mode. They need to grab your attention, and nothing does that better than grand promises. Governing, however, is a different beast. During campaigns, the key strategy is to tap into voter emotions: hope, fear, and anger. Political consultants call this emotional framing, a technique used to make promises sound personal and urgent. For example, Medicare for All has been a catchy phrase in recent US elections. However, once candidates enter office, they face the daunting task of turning such slogans into workable policies. And that's when the cracks start to show. A Princeton study found that only 39% of political campaign promises are fully kept. Why? Governing is about compromise. While campaigning, you can afford to speak in absolutes, but once in power, you have to deal with opposing views, budget constraints, and limited resources. Take Canada, for example. In 2015, Justin Trudeau promised electoral reform, but by 2017, he announced it wouldn't happen. His reasoning? He faced too many obstacles in Parliament. Campaigns don't have to worry about such practicalities, but governing demands it. In short, campaigning is all about making promises, but governing is about managing expectations. Chapter 3: The Waiting Game. How lobbyists shape policy timelines. Lobbyists play a massive role in shaping the timeline of political promises, though they work behind the scenes. Politicians often talk about swift change, but lobbyists, with deep pockets and influence, can stretch out the process, sometimes indefinitely. Lobbying is a multi-billion-dollar industry. In 2022, over $3.7 billion was spent on lobbying in the US alone, according to Open Secrets. These lobbyists work for various interests, big corporations, environmental groups, and even foreign governments, and their goal is to ensure legislation benefits their clients. They do this by influencing not just what gets passed, but how fast, or slow, it happens. Let's take healthcare reform. Politicians from both sides of the aisle have promised sweeping changes to the US healthcare system for decades. However, the industry is so heavily lobbied that even small reforms take years. Pharmaceutical companies, for example, spend more than $230 million annually on lobbying to delay policies that would lower drug prices. Lobbyists can also muddy the waters by introducing counter-legislation that slows down the process. A common tactic is to introduce amendments that force delays in negotiations. The more complicated the issue, the longer it takes to pass. This is a deliberate strategy to buy time or wear down momentum. In short, lobbyists are skilled at using time as a tool. By stretching out the legislative process, they ensure political promises remain just that, promises. Chapter 4: The Globalization Effect. International forces slowing domestic change. Political promises don't exist in a vacuum. Many times, fulfilling a domestic promise depends on international agreements or global economic trends. This makes it much harder for politicians to act quickly. Take trade agreements, for instance. A politician might promise to boost local manufacturing, but if their country is part of a free trade agreement, they can't just implement new tariffs or protections without consulting international partners. For example, under the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, any sudden change to tariffs required cooperation from the US, Mexico, and Canada. Even renegotiating NAFTA into the USMCA took nearly 2 years of talks and compromises. That's a long time when a politician's term might only last 4 years. International pressure doesn't stop at trade. Environmental agreements also slow things down. Countries that signed the Paris Climate Agreement are required to coordinate their climate policies, making it difficult to push through national environmental reforms without affecting international commitments. For example, while Germany wanted to phase out coal, their reliance on Russian gas slowed progress. They couldn't act too quickly without risking energy shortages, especially given rising geopolitical tensions. Politicians also face pressure from global financial markets. When Greece promised to expand social services in 2009, global creditors demanded austerity instead. The financial markets punished Greece by raising interest rates on government debt, making it almost impossible for them to keep their promises. This interconnectedness means one thing: a promise that looks simple domestically often becomes complicated once international obligations are factored in. Chapter 5: The Voter's Dilemma, Patience or Protest. For voters, waiting years for political promises to be fulfilled can feel like betrayal. It's no surprise that political dissatisfaction grows when promises are delayed, leading to movements like populism and protests. A study by the Pew Research Center found that only 17% of Americans trust the government, most of the time. This trust gap is largely due to the failure to deliver on promises. Politicians may ask for patience, but voters expect results, and they expect them fast. Take Brexit, for example. Voters were promised a swift exit from the European Union, but the process dragged on for more than 3 years. This delay caused significant frustration. According to a poll by YouGov in 2019, over 50% of British citizens felt their politicians had mishandled the Brexit process. Many of them turned to more extreme political figures who promised quicker results. In countries like France, the Yellow Vest movement was sparked when President Emmanuel Macron introduced fuel taxes after promising economic reform. Voters who felt ignored took to the streets, and the movement grew into a full-scale protest against the slow pace of political change. One strategy to manage voter patience is setting realistic expectations. Former US President Barack Obama was often praised for being upfront about the time needed for reforms, especially in healthcare. Still, even with this honesty, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, took almost 2 years to pass and even longer to implement fully, frustrating many supporters. Ultimately, voters want to see immediate results, but when those results are slow, they often shift their support to candidates promising faster action, even if that's unrealistic. Tap the subscribe button and be a part of our growing community.